My name's Ollie, and in this Politics Explained video, I'm going to go through everything you need to know about the interpretations and debates of the US presidency in edXL A-level politics. I'm going to start by looking at the parts of the specification this lesson covers and potential essay questions. I'm then going to have a look at briefly how effectively presidents have achieved their aims, looking at Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden so far. I'm then, in currently the most important part of the video, going to look at different theories about the presidency. So the Imperial Presidency theory, the Imperilled Presidency theory, the Dual Presidency theory, and the influence of increasing polarization. And then finally, we're going to quickly kind of wrap up by having a look at the extent of presidential accountability to Congress. The PDF you can see on your screen is part of an updated US textbook for edXL A-level politics that you can find on the Politics Explained website, where you can also find loads of resources, including essay plans and notes to help you in your politics A-level, as well as a place to sign up for tutoring if that's something you'd be interested in. But yeah, without further ado, let's get into it. So, starting off with the parts of the specification this lesson covers. So this is the final of 5 videos on the US presidency on the channel. So those videos I've looked at the formal powers of the presidency, the informal powers of the presidency, the president's role in relation to foreign policy, and the other one on 3.3, which is kind of the varying nature of presidential power. And this one looks in interpretation and debates apart from foreign policy, which was its own video. So it looks at how effectively they've achieved their aims, the Imperial Presidency, the extent of presidential accountability to Congress, and reference to presidents since 1992. So this will be really helpful for a range of questions, a range of 12 markers and 30 markers, and in particular, the interpretations will be really useful for the question of whether there's an Imperial Presidency, but these kind of different interpretations of a dual presidency, Imperial Presidency, Imperilled Presidency can be something you can bring into all of your answers, and they can be a really good way to hit those top marks. So, starting off with how effectively presidents have achieved their aims, because we've looked at in the previous video at these 4 presidents in a little bit more detail, and in a lot more detail actually across their presidency. I didn't feel the need to kind of go through that, repeat that again. So we're just going to quickly recap on their aims when coming into office, key successes and key failures. So starting off with Bush, he entered office with a focus on domestic issues, including tax cuts, education reform, and increasing energy production. But the terrorist attacks in 9/11 drastically altered his agenda, shifting his focus towards national security, the war on terror, and foreign policy. In terms of key successes, he enacted significant tax cuts in 2001 and 2003. The No Child Left Behind Act, which is a major education reform bill, was key to his campaign. It was passed in 2000, I think it was 2001 or 2002. He managed to secure a second term, showing electoral validation of his first-term policies. He played a key role in establishing the Department of Homeland Security and shifting US foreign policy to pursue the war on terror. And he initiated the Medicare prescription drug benefit, expanding coverage for seniors. In terms of his failures, the Iraq War began under false pretenses of weapons of mass destruction, became highly controversial and costly. Hurricane Katrina, so his response to Hurricane Katrina was widely criticised for being slow and inefficient. His administration faced significant criticism over the handling of the 2008 financial crisis. Social security reform efforts failed, lacking support from Congress, and Guantanamo Bay and enhanced interrogation tactics sparked significant human rights and legal controversies, with a lot of criticism and a decrease in the US's international reputation. In terms of Obama, his key aims when he came into office were kind of a real focus on domestic issues, in particular healthcare reform, economic recovery after the financial crisis, and ending the Iraq War. And his agenda also included tackling climate change and implementing financial regulation reforms in response to the financial crisis. These aims were challenged by economic crises and complex global issues, requiring a balance between domestic and international priorities. In terms of his key successes, you've got the Affordable Care Act, overseeing the recovery of the US economy post-2008, and passing a $787 billion stimulus package, stimulus package to do so. He ended US military involvement in Iraq, authorized a military operation that led to the death of Osama bin Laden, implemented the Dodd-Frank Act, which introduced financial regulatory reforms in response to the financial crisis. And he had some success with executive orders, including DACA and environmental measures. In terms of his failures, he struggled with intense partisan opposition, limiting legislative achievements in key areas, including immigration reform, gun control, and the environment. He faced criticism over the handling of the Syrian civil war and the rise of ISIS. Guantanamo Bay remained open despite promises to close it, due to effectively Congress stopping him. The Affordable Care Act faced significant implementation challenges and political resistance, including ruling in 2012, a Supreme Court ruling that states couldn't be forced to expand Medicaid, and key environmental measures, as well as the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal he signed, were immediately reversed by Trump once he came into power. Trump's presidency commenced with a focus on immigration reform, particularly the construction of the border wall with Mexico. He also aimed to dismantle Obamacare, implement tax reforms, drain the swamp, and adopt an American-first approach to foreign policy. His tenure was marked by efforts to reshape international trade agreements and a strong focus on domestic economic growth. In terms of key successes, he passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, achieved conservative reshaping of the judiciary, including appointing 3 Supreme Court justices himself, and effectively ending the presidency with a 6-3 Conservative majority in the court. He passed the First Step Act of 2018, which is a bipartisan criminal justice reform bill aimed at reducing sentences and improving rehabilitation efforts for federal prisoners. He renegotiated NAFTA with the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, implemented strict immigration policies, and made substantial progress on border wall construction, and fostered notable economic growth and low unemployment rates pre-COVID-19. His failures included being impeached twice, though not convicted by the Senate in either. He struggled and failed to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. He was kind of controversial and widely criticised for his handling of the COVID-19 pandemic and public health crisis. He faced widespread criticism for responses to racial justice protests and Black Lives Matter protests. Foreign policy challenges, particularly with North Korea, yielded mixed results. So he had kind of some key summits with Kim Jong-un, but didn't really result in any denuclearization or much decreased tensions. An increased division in America with increased inequality and violent political rhetoric included the attempted insurrection on January 6th as he was leaving the presidency. And one final one, he also didn't get his border wall fully constructed. In terms of Biden so far, so he kind of entered the presidency with a focus on tackling COVID-19, promoting economic recovery, addressing climate change, and restoring international alliances. While his administration also aimed to address systemic racial inequality and reform immigration, whilst navigating a very difficult, deeply polarised political landscape. In terms of key successes, he accelerated COVID-19 vaccine distribution and administration, passed the American Rescue Plan, rejoined the Paris Climate Agreement and prioritised climate action, proposed and began implementation of extensive infrastructure investment through the bipartisan infrastructure bill, restored relationships with key allies and re-engaged in international diplomacy, and successfully passed the Inflation Reduction Act, a significant legislative achievement aimed at addressing climate change, healthcare costs, tax reforms, and challenging the rise of China. In terms of key failures, he faced criticism over the US handling of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, which very quickly led to the Taliban regaining power. He struggled to act significant portions of the legislative agenda due to congressional gridlock, including, for example, healthcare reform and criminal justice reform, as well as actually voting reform, which was blocked because of the filibuster in particular. Immigration reforms also faced significant challenges and setbacks. The Build Back Better Act couldn't be passed due to congressional opposition from Joe Manchin, a moderate Democrat in particular. He's contended with rising inflation and economic uncertainty, and he's been criticised by the left of the Democratic Party and large numbers of young people for his strong support for Israel, despite growing numbers of casualties in Gaza. So that's a quick recap of the kind of key failures, intentions, and key successes of different presidents. What we're going to have a look at now is different theories about the presidency. These will be really useful to bring into your essays. The first important one is the Imperial Presidency theory, which was first set out by Arthur Schlesinger in 1971, and it posits that the US presidency has become increasingly powerful, often exceeding constitutional limits and ignoring the wishes of Congress, particularly during periods of war and national crisis. He argued that presidents have expanded their authority through a combination of political manoeuvring and exploitation of ambiguous constitutional provisions. And methods include executive orders to bypass Congress, aggressive foreign policy initiatives without declarations of war or congressional approval, executive agreements to kind of bypass the Senate in relation to treaties, signing statements which can act as a line-item veto, and the expansion of the executive branch's control over domestic policy. For detail and examples on all of these, look at the informal powers of the presidency and foreign policy powers of the presidency notes or videos on the channel. The imperial presidency is characterized by a diminished system of checks and balances, where the executive increasingly operates with minimal legislative or judicial oversight, often justified by national security or emergency needs. In terms of examples, so starting off with Bush, so in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, President Bush significantly expanded executive power through the authorization of the Patriot Act, which allowed for increased surveillance and search powers without conventional judicial oversight. And he also bypassed Congress by establishing Guantanamo Bay, a facility for terrorist suspects, highlighting the executive's unilateral power in matters of national security. In terms of Obama, he extensively used executive orders to achieve his policy goals when Congress failed to pass legislation to fulfill them, notably in immigration reform with DACA, which is implemented without congressional approval after the DREAM Act wasn't passed. This can show kind of the imperial power of the presidency can say effectively go and try to do what they want with little congressional approval. He also engaged in military intervention in Libya in 2011 without seeking a formal declaration of war from Congress. In terms of Trump, he declared a national emergency to divert funds to his border wall, significantly altered trade policies through executive powers, unilaterally imposing tariffs and renegotiating trade agreements, and exercised broad economic authority without direct legislative involvement. And that was particularly in relation to China, but also in relation to Mexico and Canada as well. In terms of Biden, he signed a record number of executive orders in his initial days in office, including rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement and revoking the permit for the Keystone XL pipeline. And that shows how executive orders actions can be used to rapidly reverse policies of a predecessor. And he also orders airstrikes on Syria in early 2021 without prior congressional approval, continuing the trend of presidential autonomy in military decision making. So that's the imperial presidency theory that kind of suggests that the president has a large amount of power that is increasingly beyond the Constitution and not checked by Congress in particular. On the other hand, there's an imperilled presidency theory, which presents a contrasting view to the imperial presidency, suggesting that the President of the United States often faces significant limitations and challenges in exercising power. And this argues that the President's ability to influence and execute policy is frequently constrained by various factors, both within the government and externally. Key methods highlighted by this theory include the President's reliance on persuasion as a primary tool for achieving their objectives, as the formal powers they're given in the Constitution are kind of insufficient to actively actually enact any meaningful change. And this persuasion is directed not only towards Congress, where the President has to direct or kind of navigate a complex legislative dynamics, partisan divisions, and often divided government, but also towards the public interest groups and the media, in order to gain support and pressure other branches of government. The imperial presidency also underscores the importance of building coalitions and negotiating compromises can kind of highlight that the president is more a facilitator rather than kind of making autonomous decisions themselves. And this reflects the intricate checks and balances of the American political system, portraying the president as often struggling against these kind of checks and balances, institutional constraints, and political opposition, and limitations of the office himself. And it can be argued, however, this actually leads the president to act imperially. This isn't a key part of the theory. It could be argued they're actually linked. The imperial presidency, because of kind of key limitations of the formal powers of the office, forces them to try and find a way around Congress in order to get anything done through executive orders, executive agreements, etc. In terms of Bush, despite his strong stance on national security, he faced significant challenges in implementing his social security reform plan in 2005. And he failed to gain sufficient support from both Congress and the public, ultimately leading to the proposal's failure. And that shows kind of the limits. As for Obama's power, apart from his first 2 years when he was able to pass the Affordable Care Act and significant legislation to address the financial crisis under unified government, he failed to pass any significant legislation on, or much at all significant legislation on key issues such as the environment, gun control, and immigration, and was forced to implement less significant changes through executive orders, many of which then became immediately reversed once Trump came into power. And Trump, even with a Republican majority in his first 2 years, Trump was unable to achieve two of his key policy goals due to a lack of support from Republican moderates, and that's repealing the Affordable Care Act and funding his border wall. And further, the executive order he used to redirect funding for the wall was only enough to build 458 miles of the wall, whilst his attempt to reverse DACA was blocked by the Supreme Court. And it shows key institutional constraints and could suggest that it's kind of imperiled rather than an imperial presidency. It can also be seen in the fact that Biden failed to pass the Build Back Better Act, despite majorities in Congress due to opposition from one senator in Joe Manchin, obviously along with the Republicans. And his attempt to write off 400 billion, I think it was 430 billion in student loan debt was also blocked by the Supreme Court, holding a key aim of his administration and suggesting that the presidency is potentially imperiled and faces key constitutional constraints which really limit their power. And the final key theory we're going to have a look at is a dual presidency theory, which is articulated by political scientist Aaron Wildavsky, which posits that there are two key realms of presidential authority, one in which they have a lot of power, one in which they don't. So it suggests that presidents often experience significantly more success and autonomy in foreign policy than they do in domestic policy, where they have a lot less power. So in the international arena, they're seen as having a broader scope of action, less constrained by Congress and more unilateral power, partly due to the inherent nature of foreign policy, which requires kind of quick action and which their power of as commander-in-chief allows them to really control. Whereas in domestic policy, presidents frequently face more significant challenges, including rigorous checks and balances, greater scrutiny from the media, public opinion, and a more complex negotiation process with different parties in Congress, because they ultimately require Congress to pass all legislation to get anything done in domestic affairs. And this highlights a stark contrast in the power dynamics between these two spheres, emphasizing the relative ease with which presidents can act on the global stage compared to the really kind of contentious and constrained environment of domestic politics. In terms of examples, under Bush in domestic policy, he faced significant challenges passing his social security legislation and was damaged due to his kind of administration's slow and inefficient response to Hurricane Katrina in 2005. Whereas by contrast, in foreign policy, he was able to initiate a fundamental shift and swiftly initiate military interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq, with the kind of relatively less kind of congressional public resistance, at least immediately. In terms of Obama, as we've kind of talked about, faced significant hurdles passing key legislative initiatives, including in relation to gun control, immigration, and the environment. He was kind of had more autonomy in foreign policy. And this kind of theory also kind of speaks to the idea that because they're so constrained in domestic policy, presidents naturally kind of look to kind of have more impact in foreign policy, particularly once they have a divided government. And so this can be seen in authorizing the death of Osama bin Laden, which was with limited congressional involvement, and also seeking to shape the world by pivoting US foreign policy to Asia, and also signing the Iran nuclear deal. Trump struggled with domestic policy initiatives like healthcare reform, facing opposition and even from within his own party, which led to him being unable to reverse the Affordable Care Act. In foreign affairs, he unilaterally implemented a lot of significant changes, though, such as withdrawing the US from the Iran nuclear deal and Paris climate agreements, demonstrating greater latitude in international decisions. Kind of suggesting, more power in the international arena, less power in domestic policy. And his power over foreign policy was clear, as his often controversial rhetoric, including about leaving NATO, worried European leaders who took this very seriously. An example, one of his tweets here. In terms of Biden, he's faced significant domestic policy challenges, notably in attempting to pass substantial parts of its infrastructure and social spending bills through a closely divided Congress. But in foreign policy, he's been able to act decisively and independently. I'd say it's potentially a bit less useful in relation to Biden, to be honest, because he actually has been able to pass quite a lot domestically, even with a divided government with significant bipartisan cooperation. In terms of the influence of increasing polarization, it can be argued that the increasing polarization over the past decade has heightened the truth of the imperial, imperilled, and dual presidency theories. So though the president still remains powerful and is able to pass legislation under a unified government, When there's divided government, they're majorly imperiled, as Congress often refuses to work with the president, seeks to halt their agenda, and block their every move. This leads to the Imperial Presidency, as the president must use executive orders and agreements and other methods to seek to achieve their policy goals so that they can please their supporters and have a strong platform with which to seek re-election in the next presidential election. And they're also driven to focusing on foreign policy, where congressional oversight and influence has been more limited, as it allows them to have influence and make a mark as president despite their relative impotence domestically. So you don't have to agree with all that, just kind of an idea where you can talk about how the kind of increasing polarization has led to these kind of theories and a kind of idea of how they potentially interact. Final quick thing we're going to have a look at is the extent of presidential accountability to Congress. So for far more detail to support these arguments, look at the videos on foreign policy, the very nature of presidential power, and Congress's legislative and oversight functions. But I thought we'd quickly give a quick summary at the end, just because it's a part of the spec, even though it's covered a lot more in these other videos. So firstly, the ways in which the president remains accountable to Congress. So Congress has oversight power, enabling it to kind of, through committees, review, monitor, and supervise the federal government. In foreign policy, while the president is commander-in-chief, Congress has the power to declare war and ratify treaties. And this sought to assert itself through the War Powers Resolution in particular and using the power of the purse. Congress holds the impeachment power. The president requires legislative support to pass kind of all enduring policies that can't be easily reversed by successors, as executive orders can, and laws can't. And they need congressional support for all of these laws. Congress controls the federal budget through its power of the purse. The Senate's power to confirm presidential appointments, including for Supreme Court justice and cabinet appointments, enables them to block them. It can be argued that a key way that the president is kind of accountable to Congress. Under a divided government, often occurring after midterms, Congress can disrupt the president's agenda, highlighting the dynamic interplay and accountability between the executive and legislative branches, and the fact that the president remains very much accountable to Congress and that Congress can block the president's agenda. And Congress can also override a president's veto. In terms of ways in which the president's accountability to Congress is limited, the president often has significant leeway in foreign policy decisions, drawing from the fact that their commander-in-chief, the kind of fast-paced nature of international relations and often having to respond to immediate threats means that congressional approval isn't sought. Executive orders allow the president to act unilaterally to drive domestic policy without congressional approval. In foreign policy, they can do the same with executive agreements, which don't require Senate ratification as treaties do. Earlier in their term, presidents can also use their electoral mandate to push through policies, capitalising on their recent election victory to assert their agenda. And when the government is unified, the president receives less effective oversight from Congress, particularly if the president's party is in the majority. And a popular president can exert significant influence over party members in Congress, especially if they have strong support from the party base, thereby swaying their decisions and diminishing checks on their power. So yeah, a bit of a shorter video, but that's the final one on the channel on the US presidency. Let me know if you have any comments or questions in the comment section below, and I'll be back with some videos on the Supreme Court and civil rights.